Good day, we are Carlitos Cunanan and Cedric Epua, and we are here today to discuss Chapter 4 Fun Home in the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower. We will be analyzing 5 pages. Pages 109, 114, 115, 118, and 120.
In page 109, Allison narrates how her breasts have grown, or budded, against her will. She links together the erotic and botanical through the translation of Proust Volume 2, which in the process loses its sexual meaning. The signifier is botany, and what it signifies is the erotic. This relationship is arbitrary. Thus, the ideas which are previously completely unrelated can now be linked together. With this, we can liken the growth of a plant to the development of a human being. The growth and budding of plant life is natural and uncontrolled, and likewise, Allison's breasts grow naturally when she reaches puberty, and not even she can control it despite it being in her own body. This represents the fact that Allison has no control over society's heteronormative expectations for her, and this acts as a roadblock for Allison, which we will see later on page 118. Botany is an important motif in this chapter, as it is used to describe not only Allison's sexuality and conflict, but Bruce's as well, particularly in page 92, wherein he is compared to a lilac. Its description on the page represents how Bruce's presence was fading from Allison's life long before he actually died. However, the color of a lilac, which is purple, is traditionally linked to femininity, which is reflected in Bruce's gay tendencies. Plants, in this case, can represent the sexuality and development of a human person. Our key takeaway from this page is that Allison makes excellent use of signifier signified and symbolism to illustrate the conflict that she faces as her body grows to become more feminine, in contrast to her ideals of expressing masculinity.
Pages 114 and 115 are composed of multiple panels, but thanks to the framing and panel size, the reader's focus is brought to three larger panels that question Allison's sexuality and expression of masculinity. In the first panel, Allison narrates her failure to shoot a gun. Guns are normally associated with men due to the traditional gender perceptions which brand men as strong and powerful, similar to a gun. The gun is also highlighted due to its distinct black color, which then draws readers' attention toward it. Allison's brother is also positioned so that his head separates Allison, who is biologically female, from her hands in the gun, which is perceived as masculine. It can be interpreted that Allison cannot yet be one with the concept of masculinity, and that although Allison makes attempts to be perceived as masculine, she is still facing conflict in this regard. It's also ironic because in page 95, Allison is shown watching cowboy shooting. The second panel establishes the presence of the snake in the spring, with Allison positioned furthest from it. Interestingly, in the previous panel, where the snake is absent, Allison is shown to be positioned in front. This is non-conforming to standard gender roles, which declare that men are brave and rise up to the danger. Allison makes clever use of perspective to position herself furthest from the snake, which conveys a message similar to the first panel, that she faces conflict in her sexuality journey. The snake is also a symbol of gender confusion and ambiguity, because while the snake is shaped like a penis, it is also commonly associated with feminine power in religion and mythology, which leads to the snake representing a muddled, unclear sexuality. In this sense, the event can also represent Allison's inability to come into terms with her sexual fluidity and identity. The third panel concludes the other two. Her inability to shoot the gun and deal with the snake has brought upon her a post-lapsarian melancholy, with post-lapsarian meaning occurring after the fall of man. The fall of man here is most likely referring to Allison failing to be masculine when the situation called for it, and this brings her deep sadness because she is unable to express it. The panel before this one also states she is both relieved and embarrassed that the snake was gone, which likely comes from the fact that she failed to be manly and not having to face a snake anymore and be embarrassed about that lack as well as sexual confusion. The key takeaway here is that Allison makes an outstanding use of perspective, symbolism, and diction to illustrate the difficulty she faces in coming to terms with her own sexuality.
Allison narrates her first time seeing a bulldyke on a trip with her father to Philadelphia, and how something awakened in her on that day, outlining the struggles that she will have to face in the future as well. Allison draws the characters in such a way that when abstracted, represents her struggles with gender fluidity. In the first panel, the bulldyke is on the left and in focus, which shows that she is being depicted as something larger. Upon abstraction, she represents or symbolized an idealized version of Allison, which her ideals are being lived to the fullest, as someone who can openly and freely express their sexuality. In the same panel, child Allison is on the right and is the smallest character present, while she and the bulldyke are being positioned on extreme opposites of the page. This shows that although they initially seem very close and similar at first, they're actually very far apart, and Allison still has a lot to go through to reach the level of bulldyke. Taking into account what the bulldyke represents, this distance represents the quantity and magnitude of gender fluidity struggles that Allison will have to tackle to reach her goals. It was on this day that Allison started receiving hints about her homosexual nature. Lastly, Bruce is positioned in between the bulldyke, as if acting as a wall or an obstacle that is in the way of Allison's goals, which we have already seen in previous events. Bruce is a concrete representation of society's heteronormative influence and pressure, as it was this pressure that developed in Bruce the idea that he should hide his true sexuality.
And he is imposing those ideals on his daughter.
In the second panel of the page, Allison chooses to show only the upper bodies of herself and Bruce in order to make Bruce look much larger than her. This represents just how high the magnitude of obstacles in Allison's path will be as she comes to terms with her gender expression. As if Bruce were a giant wall. These two often come head to head in their gender expression related disagreements, such as in Chapter 1 where Bruce designed Allison's room. Similar to the bulldyke and Allison in the previous panel, Bruce and Allison are also similarly distant on opposite sides of the page, and this distance is a representation of the conflict that these two will have due to the result of gender issues. And it also puts into perspective that although they both have gender expression issues, their worlds are still vastly different. This distance can be interpreted as the absence of a paternal figure in Allison's life, as his presence has been stated to disappear long before he died. Our key takeaway here is that through her usage of perspective and symbolism in positioning characters, Allison illustrates the gender fluidity and expression conflicts that she has to clash with, in the form of her father to reach her ideal expressive self.
In the final page of the chapter, Allison looks back at three pictures, two of her father and one of herself. Right from the get-go, this page is graphically different from the others as the illustrations here display a good eye for detail. The first picture is a picture of Bruce, a man wearing a woman's bathing suit and posing elegantly, displaying gender confusion as masculinity and femininity intertwine. Without Allison's commentary saying that it's Bruce, it would arouse confusion in readers as to who the person is, as Bruce is hardly recognizable. This image is also the cover image of the chapter on page 87, which wrapped the entire chapter under the theme of gender fluidity, confusion, and conflict. The next two photos are for Self and her father, which are noticeably detailed. According to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, if something is more anchored to reality, with very defined features that make it distinct, it's harder for someone to see themselves in the character. This may be used to emphasize individuality and separation from other individuals. However, even with Allison's elaborately detailed drawings, Allison and her father still appear strikingly similar. The angle at which the sunlight strikes their face produces the same shadow patterns, and both also happen to be grinning the same way at nearly the same age. This allows for readers to be able to see Allison and Bruce and Allison. Despite the differences, it is emphasized through this concept that they still have some things in common, as if they were two opposite sides of the same coin. This also alludes to and reinforces the ideas of Proust in several ways. In the same chapter, Allison mentions how several of Proust's titles lost some meanings in translation, such as Sodom et Gomorrah to Cities of the Plain, and Remembrance of Things Past to In Search of Lost Time. The idea of translation and the loss that comes with it appears again in the photos of Allison and Bruce on page 120, as if implying that Allison is a translation of her father but with some differences. Aside from that, Proust also uses the word inverts to refer to homosexuals, which is perfectly fitting in the case of Allison and Bruce, simultaneously being both so similar yet so different. The idea is important as it resurfaces in future chapters, like in chapter 7. These allusions, similar to every other allusion in the book, serve as a framework for Allison to understand her reality and struggles. Our key takeaway from this page is that the use of elaborately detailed illustrations and allusions to Proust allow Allison to present her relationship with her father in the context of their sexual conflicts, by showing how they are so similar and yet so different.
In conclusion, through the exceptional use of perspective, detailed illustrations, symbolism, and allusions to Proust, In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower presents to readers Allison's continuous conflict with her gender fluidity and expression since childhood, and as a result, the tense relationship she shares with her father. We thank you for your time and we hope that you learned something new about Fun Home.